One Take Show, a podcast where we celebrate incredible conversations with some exceptional people. In this episode, I have this opportunity to talk to Mr. Sanjay Hegde. Sir is a senior advocate practicing before Supreme Court of India, and obviously, Sir needs no introduction whatsoever. In fact, I feel inept when I try to encapsulate his genius and his illustrious career in some form of words so I can convey my emotions and my feelings to my dear audience. But trust me, in this episode, we are going to learn about Sir's experience through litigation. We'll also talk about his suggestions for the law students and legal aspirants who are trying to make it big in litigation. We will also talk about some very burning issues. One of them is online censorship and the issue of accountability. We will also talk about the need of anti-lynching laws in our country. And finally, we will touch upon a very relevant experience of Sir's being an interlocutor appointed by Supreme Court of India to Shaheen Bagh, where we talk about the issue of public order as against right to protest. All of this in this just one episode of the One Take Show. Hence, ladies and gentlemen, let's start the podcast. Hello, sir. Welcome to the One Take Show. I am truly blessed to have this honor to have this conversation with you. I think this is a dream for any law student to have such opportunity to learn from luminaries and leaders in the legal field who have paved the way, have shown us the dreams that we all look forward to. Thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with me for this conversation. I'm really grateful. Thank you so much for this opportunity, sir.
Thank you, Kaustubh, for having me. There's nothing on honor and things like that. You talk to any senior lawyer, as long as he is not pressed for time, most of us are willing to talk. And most of us are just juniors who have grown old. It's nothing much. Because each of us is constantly learning. And many of us can keep making some error or the other, which somebody junior may not make. In fact, there was a nice line which I once read that a good law school education teaches you to be attorney general or nothing else.
Right.
So many of the youngsters are fully equipped in terms of knowledge to take on a lot of issues. But they may lack the experience.
Right.
They may sort of think they know it all and they can convey it all. And one of my colleagues once told me his first appearance in court, where he went all straight from law school with a lot of moot court experience, and said, "May it please the court," and this and that and the whole thing with perfect clipped accent. Only for the High Court judge to just look at him and say, "Eh?" and he just did not know how to respond to that.
Right, sir.
So experience teaches you what the judge is thinking, what the judge wants.
Right, sir.
A good law school will teach you the basics of law, but you have to marry it with experience.
Right, sir. I think this is exactly the kind of conversation that inspired me personally to have this platform, so that I can learn about these little bits and bits about the journey, which only begs the question. So you've had a very illustrious career that has inspired so many people at different stages, and you must have had points in your life when you must have realized, okay, this legal field is something that I want to marry into. This legal field is something that I want to explore. What inspired you to move towards law, and how was your journey like from law school to your litigation career?
First thing, I didn't go to law school. I was of the last generation before the law school actually came, before the first law school came in Bangalore. In fact, I was in a Karnataka town, my hometown called Udupi then. And there were professors who told me, wait for a year and then go try for the National Law School. But that time, I really was not looking at a legal career. My father was a lawyer, but then I had not decided what I wanted to be in life. I thought I would probably do journalism, or I would do a course in English literature. When you're young, lots of fields seem open to you.
Right.
And then, after I finished my college in Udupi, I moved on to Bombay, joined a law school primarily to keep on quizzing. I'd also started working with a corporate organization. It was one of those early computer companies. But kept going to my law college for evening classes.
Right, sir.
So at the end of 3 years, I then joined a Bombay firm, and then I knew that I would continue in the legal field.
Right.
Of course, at that point of time, I was also doing my LLM, and I had qualified for the civil services. I had got one of the allied services.
Right.
So that was a second string to my bow.
Right, sir. That must have been one.
No, just to make one point.
Right, sir.
I was never one of those who decided at age 6 that he was going to be a lawyer. I sort of drifted into it.
Right, sir. That is a very inspiring story. The fact that you've molded yourself into this experience and have grown with this experience has shown that it's actually possible for every student who is still trying to figure their path out to actually go out and explore the same. This brings a very pertinent question at this point, is that you've had such an illustrious career with litigation very particularly, and litigation is one of the most sought after career options for any law student. But yet litigation poses a lot of challenges for fresh legal aspirants, or we say the first generation lawyers particularly. Any of these aspirants would love to learn about from your litigation experience. So what advice do you have for them, certain set skills that they can improve upon, or what experience that they can have?
See, there is no one path to litigation. I've often said, and that's basically in the context of my experiences in the Supreme Court, that it is a bit like the Hindi film industry. Every year you have a fresh crop of aspirants. Everybody thinks he's going to be a star. You join there, and you start as an assistant something somewhere, and you have your dreams. Every year, a consecutive year, you see people being winnowed out, people saying, no, this is not for me, people going into corporate jobs, people going into some civil service or something like that. But my take is that if you keep at it,
right, sir,
you have something to offer, then the market finds its own use. Not everybody in the film industry ended up as a star, right, but many of them became great directors. Many of them became great lyricists. So the industry finds its own use for you. I do not think that if somebody in litigation constantly keeps working at it, does not give in to frustration or vice. People do go off the rails, drinking and things like that, out of boredom, if nothing else.
Right.
If you keep steadily at it, I don't think anybody dies hungry.
Right, sir. That's a very important facet. Sticking with your interest and possibly pursuing it to the end is something that is a running narrative when it comes to litigation, because it's a field that demands time, and as you previously mentioned, experience is what really gives and adds so much value to the candidates. This allows me to move to a very interesting aspect of our conversation, sir. I mean, I would love to cover everything under the sun, but very particularly about you've had very high standards for ethics, and you've spoken about a lot of socio-political issues. You've previously mentioned that you've had interest with journalism and article writing, and we have read those prolific articles, multiple instances talking about those issues. One such major issue that has recently come up is where you talk about curbing the censorship on platforms like social media or other such platforms. We would love to know about what conceptually you've experienced with that and what you understand with this issue.
See, there are various facets of it. And my particular sense is that technology has moved ahead of the law. And it's one thing to say freedom of speech, but the freedom to stand in a corner and declaim what you want is not exactly freedom of speech. There is also a freedom of reach, which the technology platforms allow you. What you say on Twitter or Facebook is magnified.
Right.
Now, that freedom of reach is today in private hands. Once it is in private hands, do you necessarily succumb to the private sector's rules?
Right.
Or is freedom of speech a public good where the private sector also has to play the role of a fair regulator?
Right, sir.
These are issues which have now come about in greater contrast in the US, where Twitter says that, look, if Trump says something, we have the right to say that this is false news or put out a flag of our own. Right. Facebook says, no, we will not do that. And therefore, Facebook is facing a backlash. Right. So these are great issues of law. And I don't see why it should necessarily be litigated only in the US.
Right, sir.
We have our own legal system, and it has a common ancestry. It has common values with the common law world. I think that this is a great opportunity for Indian courts also to get into it as fast as possible, get into definitions, and the faster that things like these issues are thrashed out at the High Court level, that they could reach the Supreme Court.
Right, sir. Right. At this point, sir, are there any particular issues with respect to such various censorship issues, as you've mentioned, with various social media platforms which are now privately regulated and now have a role to play in this public sphere, especially when it comes to the limelight of constitutional rights and the duties that are now awarded? Do you think are there certain particular requirements or demands that we as citizens should raise either before these private regulators or before the courts in India in order to somehow evolve with this jurisprudence that you talk about?
See, these are private entities, and they take the view that, look, we run a closed club on our rules.
Right.
You either follow those rules and remain on the platform, or we do not deal with us. Right. Now, this is great power. But this is great power with regard to a public utility, that is public free speech, the right to inform and be informed.
Right, sir.
Now, is it right to leave these regulatory functions in private hands? Or should necessarily a neutral body, may not be the state, should there not be a neutral body? Maybe the private sector can have ombudsmen of their own.
Right, sir.
Or maybe the state should regulate and say that you must have an independent regulator. Because right now what happens is that very often these things are, in the first instance, left to AI bots. Right. AI bots can then take a particular call. It's only thereafter that if you appeal, that a human looks at it. Now, a human, when he looks at it, does he look at it from the point of view of whether the AI bot is working, or whether there is a real issue which requires definition, or how he handles it? There is no transparency whatsoever. Right. I would like to see much greater transparency in the regulation of the business of speech. Right. If you make your money out of the marketplace of ideas, you should run a fair market.
Right.
Otherwise, it's like a casino of ideas where the house always wins.
Right, sir. That is very important, because as you mentioned, that these platforms have huge repercussions and consequences. The influence that it has on the people or the viewership or everyone who tunes into this into these platforms have been influenced by the ideas that get shared. For example, Facebook almost has the user base which is paramount to a population of any small country. We see that this influence actually happens. Would you say that since the influence is at such a large scale, can actually influence processes like elections in certain countries, like United States, the entire issue that arose, such transparency at that point becomes indispensable?
That's exactly what I said, that if you trade in the marketplace of ideas,
Right.
if that is your business, then it definitely has to be the state's business to ensure that there is independent regulation,
Right.
that marketplace of ideas is not skewed, that there is no finger on the scale. Now, there was all this thing about Cambridge Analytica. What did Cambridge Analytica do? All that it did was to analyze your likes and your shares on Facebook, and it probably knew you better than your own spouse. So then it could mine data and have it available for politicians as to what message to pitch. For much before the Trump campaign, it was the Obama campaign of 2012 who knew when to pitch to the Democratic base. It would target vulnerable donors at a time that they just left their work spots, had just sat down in the bar, and were contemplating in the election on some TV screen or the other while having the first drink. That's when they're most expansive and receptive to politics. That's when the mail would drop in saying that I'm going to be outspent by Romney, this, that, and the other if you do not. So their data is the new gold.
Right, sir.
Your minds are now open to not only the surveillance state but to surveillance corporations.
Right.
Why social media is also surveillance corporations rebranded.
Right.
Today, almost anyone who looks at your or my social media accounts will know what I eat, will probably know the upholstery in my house, will know so many things about me, which would not necessarily have been in the public domain 20 years ago.
Right, sir.
So with that kind of power, should there not be responsibility and accountability?
Most certainly. Right.
And can you only trust the corporation to self-regulate? I think not.
Right, sir. I think that is what explains this entire debate, this entire issue that has now arisen, and which is really capturing a lot of this conversation space as to whether these private regulators should be allowed to have autonomy where it is completely unfettered with, or should state play a role. And you very precisely explained it to us. I would now take this conversation to a rather different tangent, sir, which is very important for us to also understand, is that you've also spoken about issues like the anti-lynching laws, and these issues have now also surfaced across the world, plaguing particularly our country for the recent times that this issue has now caught the traction. What do you say about how important it is for a country like India to embrace these changes with legislative policies, for example, with anti-lynching laws and other such developments?
See, anti-lynching laws, they've been tried. They were attempted even in the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate, and they were blocked by the southern states in the Senate. And then finally, the U.S. Senate apologized barely a few years ago. What is lynching? Lynching is essentially when the majority gets together and decides that it can deliver instant retribution to an unprotected minority. You can have laws, but ultimately the cure is social when each individual among us realizes that we are all in a minority of one. We may temporarily be in a majority and of the same identity as people in the majority who are lynching. That is when we are required to stand up for the solitary guy. In all these many lynching videos and photographs that have emerged, probably the one image that remains in my mind is of that Sikh policeman in Uttarakhand who stood up and defended one person and saved one life. So that is the requirement. And essentially, the anti-lynching laws that we proposed, which we worked on and came out as directives from the Supreme Court, try to ensure that at least the law enforcement agencies do not side on the mob and will be forced to account for either siding with the mob or for failing to defend the individual.
Right, sir. Right, because this exactly is what has been somehow debated as into requirement that we've observed right now. The laws that we have all witnessed and we have understood that there is an urgent requirement for the same. The human rights violation or any such incidences actually harm the constitutional spirit in large. And I believe who better to learn this from but you. Well, thank you for that explanation, sir. I think this will really benefit anyone who's trying to work with this project or trying to learn more about anti-lynching laws. At this point, once again, so I will take this conversation to a rather very interesting sphere. Very recently, we've had a very interesting development with you that you were appointed as one of the interlocutors on behalf of the Supreme Court of India for the Shaheen Bagh mediation, and won't get into the very specificities of the same, but would probably like to know about what was your the principle behind such appointment, the conceptualization behind this appointment.
Yes, see, the matter has not formally been disposed of. Me and Sadhna were sent as interlocutors. We tried our best, and at least one of the things that happened is that at the Shaheen Bagh site, nothing violent occurred.
Right, sir.
So I do not think that the entire exercise was futile. It was a very good learning experience for a lot of people, including the two interlocutors.
Right, sir.
Now, the one thing that I want to tell you was, and this is what, before I was appointed, I was watching those the hearings in court. And one of the things that the judges felt was that, look, there are questions of constitutionality with regard to the CAA which are pending in court. But the court can only check for constitutionality, and it's often a procedural check. Do you have powers? Have any limitations of the constitution been breached, etc.?
Right, sir.
But as far as wisdom is concerned, or legislative wisdom is concerned, often it is a matter of political campaigns and protests and all that. Right. So the right to protest, which is a constitutional norm in any democracy, is also an important constitutional process which ought to be protected. But the right to protest cannot obviously lead to negation of others' rights, the right to public usage of a road. See, just like the Shaheen Bagh situation, today in the US, you have what is called the Seattle Soviet. That there is one zone which is sort of in Seattle which has declared itself almost autonomous.
Right, sir.
Maybe they're not blocking crucial roads. But very often, protest movements end up being identified with sites.
Right.
So there are very many legal issues. I do not know whether the Supreme Court will examine these issues in this particular case or in some other case. But suffice it to say, for the moment, that uh, the Supreme Court probably was aware
Right.
that the greatest tragedies
Mhm.
is not where there is a fight between right and wrong,
Right.
but where there is a fight between two rights.
Wow.
There's the right of protest, there's
Mhm.
the right of access to a freeway, and they tried to see whether uh, interlocution by a trained mediator, and Sadhana Ramchandran is one of the great trained mediators in the Indian legal system, could help the process.
Right.
It didn't go. It possibly didn't help all the way, or did not come to a full conclusion.
Mhm.
But I do believe it had a positive impact.
Right, sir. It most certainly did, sir. A lot of media outlets, a lot of news agencies have continuously reported and have appreciated the attempts that any of, as you mentioned, the entire site of Shaheen Bagh and the entire protest was majorly peaceful, which was a very positive outlook and a positive result of the various unfortunate developments that were happening in the capital. But this is something that has been upheld by a lot of listeners, viewers, and the ones who have celebrated the fact that the peace prevailed majorly in that site. This only begs the question, which possibly will be my last question at this point, is that this entire debate about the balance between the right to protest and raise the voice as against right to public order, or as you mentioned, the right to access to a certain situation, certain highway, certain road, often gets entangled in this debate that happens in this political atmosphere, and the rights often get overlooked or they get debated a lot. For a law student to understand this and to measure between the two, what in your opinion would be a correct balance between a right to protest and the public order?
See, uh, the a protest necessarily presupposes
Mm-hmm.
that it is against the existing order.
Right, right.
So the existing order often tries to portray itself as the only concept of public order.
Right, sir.
I would think that in any healthy society, there has to be a creative tension
Mm-hmm.
between the forces of status quo and the forces of change.
Right.
There has to be an avenue in which anybody who thinks that something is wrong
Mm-hmm.
can lay out the protest. That protest cannot be violent.
Mm-hmm.
That protest cannot be at the cost of the normal intercourse that exists between other people who are not protesting.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You have a right to protest, but you do not have the right to disrupt the lives of others.
Right. Right.
So the real trade-off or boiling point comes when protests are allowed to go on forever.
Mm-hmm.
And the protesters sometimes think that unless you actually disrupt lives, nobody is going to listen.
Right.
So what is most required at protests
Mm-hmm.
is somebody who is authorized,
Mm-hmm.
somebody of goodwill, who
Mhm.
will listen to what the protest is about and try to make a bad situation better.
Right, sir. Right. I think that is the principle that we should take up. I think this is very important, that the authorities or anyone who's responsible can actually initiate a dialogue or sort of an acknowledgement of the reasons and the principles behind a protest, which we have also read before that you mentioned. And I think this is the highlight of how exactly there can be a balance between the right to protest and public order, so that the extreme situations can be avoided. Thank you so much, sir. I think this conversation was probably one of the most enriching conversations I've had. I've had the opportunity to learn from your experience and to learn about your perspective upon the litigation career, and to learn about the various aspects, anti-lynching laws. We talk about the curbing of censorship on social media platforms, and finally the interlocutory part of your experience and how exactly there can be a balance between right to protest and public order. Thank you so much, sir. Do you have any closing remarks for our listeners?
Well, I do not preach sermons on the mount. The one thing that I'd like to say is that, there are so many people in law schools Not everybody will necessarily end up as a lawyer or a litigating lawyer or a corporate lawyer. But a law school does discipline you to think things through, to write things through, and to
Right.
reason for yourself.
Mhm.
Never lose that particular skill.
Right.
That itself is worth an education and worth all the 5 years. All the best. Enjoy yourself. Enjoy what you're doing.
Right, sir. Thank you so much, sir. I most certainly will live up to this principle, and I think everyone who tunes into this podcast will benefit a lot from this conversation and will take away so many points so that they can improve themselves and gain a lot of perspective. I had a wonderful time, sir. Obviously, the most blessed opportunity that I've had. I hope you had a good time too.
I had a good time. Thank you very much, Kaustav.
Thank
We'll
you.
keep talking.
Thank you so much.